The first thing the audience heard was not applause. It was silence so complete that even the stage crew stopped breathing. Under a single white spotlight stood a man in faded work boots, a navy maintenance shirt with his name stitched over the pocket, and a pair of calloused hands resting quietly at his sides. 40 feet away, America's biggest music superstar folded her arms and smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had never once expected to lose. "One song," she said into the microphone, her voice echoing through the sold-out theater. "That's all I'm asking. If you're really so confident about the sound system, prove you know music." A ripple of laughter spread through the orchestra seats. Hundreds of phones lifted into the air. Nobody believed the maintenance technician would actually step forward. Nobody noticed the little girl sitting near the wings clutching a worn backpack against her chest. She wasn't laughing. Her eyes never left the man on stage because she knew something the crowd didn't. The man they were mocking had made her a promise years ago. He would never sing for strangers again. Caleb Brooks looked toward his daughter only once. She gave the smallest nod, the kind only a child who trusted her father completely could give. He slowly unclipped the backstage security badge hanging from his neck, placed it on the edge of a grand piano, and took one measured step toward the vintage microphone waiting beneath the spotlight. Across the stage, Vivian Hart's smile barely changed, but her manager leaned closer and whispered that they should end the stunt before it embarrassed everyone involved. She dismissed him with a wave. To her, this was harmless entertainment. A technician with an opinion had accepted a challenge he couldn't possibly survive. Around them, crew members exchanged amused glances. Camera operators quietly adjusted their angles, sensing an unexpected viral moment. Somewhere in the balcony, someone shouted that this would be over in 10 seconds. Caleb heard every word. None of it changed the steady rhythm of his breathing. He reached into the inside pocket of his work jacket and carefully removed a folded sheet of yellowed music paper, its edges softened by years of careful handling. He unfolded it with the same care another man might use to open a family photograph. Vivian noticed the paper for the first time. Something about the way he handled it made her confident expression hesitate, if only for an instant. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity she couldn't explain. Why would a maintenance worker carry handwritten music that looked decades old? Caleb rested the page on the piano without saying a single word. Then he quietly asked the pianist one unexpected question. "Would you mind playing it exactly as it's written?" The elderly pianist studied the faded notes. His fingers froze above the keys. He looked up at Caleb with widening eyes, then back down at the score as though he had just recognized a signature hidden inside the music itself. The color slowly drained from his face. Without warning, he stood from the piano bench, took one respectful step backward, and whispered words that only the front row could hear. This song was never supposed to be sung again." The whisper swept across the front row before anyone understood what had just happened. The elderly pianist did not touch a single key. Instead, he stared at the faded manuscript as though it had been pulled from another lifetime, then carefully turned the page over, searching for something hidden on the back. There was nothing except a date written in worn blue ink and a single set of initials that meant nothing to the crowd but seemed to leave the old musician unable to speak. Vivian Hart frowned for the first time that evening. This was supposed to be a harmless challenge, not a mysterious interruption. Trevor stepped forward, forcing a polite smile, and suggested they replace the music with one of Vivian's chart-topping songs. Caleb quietly shook his head. "If it is not this song, then I will not sing." Why would one forgotten piece of music matter so much? Why refuse the easiest path out? The audience shifted uneasily as laughter slowly disappeared. Near the curtain, Naomi tightened both hands around her backpack. Hidden inside was a small metal lunchbox that rattled every time she breathed too quickly. She glanced toward her father, then looked down as if protecting a secret she had carried for years. Elena Foster noticed the child's anxious expression and walked over, kneeling beside her. "Is your dad nervous?" she asked softly. Naomi smiled with surprising confidence. "He is not afraid of singing," she answered. "He is afraid of what happens after people hear him." The answer only created a bigger question. What could possibly happen after one song? Across the stage, the pianist finally sat down again, but before placing his hands on the keys, he looked directly at Caleb. "I have waited almost 20 years to see this page again," he said quietly. Several orchestra musicians exchanged confused glances. None of them had ever seen the veteran accompanist look shaken. Vivian folded her arms tighter, trying to hide the growing uncertainty behind a practiced smile. She had performed in sold-out arenas across the country, yet somehow she suddenly felt as though she had walked into someone else's story. Trevor leaned close and whispered that they should cancel the stunt before social media turned it into an embarrassment. Vivian ignored him. Her curiosity had become stronger than her pride. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment, not as a performer preparing for applause, but as a father remembering a promise. In his mind, he could still hear a hospital room, a trembling hand holding his own, and a voice asking him to choose family over fame. He had kept that promise every single day since. Tonight was the first time he had come close to breaking it. The pianist lifted his fingers above the keyboard, but instead of beginning, he looked into the audience and asked a question no one expected. "Before I play this," he said, "does anyone here know who actually wrote this song?" Hundreds of heads slowly shook no. Caleb lowered his eyes. Naomi held her breath. Then, from the back of the theater, a frail voice suddenly answered, "I do. And none of you have any idea who that man really is." The entire theater turned toward the elderly voice at the back, but before anyone could identify the speaker, Caleb quietly raised one hand. "Please," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "Do not say another word." The request stunned everyone. If the stranger truly knew his past, why would Caleb silence the only witness who could explain everything? The old man slowly removed his cap and nodded with reluctant understanding, honoring a wish that clearly carried more weight than curiosity. Trevor seized the moment. "There it is," he announced loudly. "He is hiding something. We cannot let an unidentified man interrupt a nationally televised rehearsal." Security guards exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for instructions. Vivian watched Caleb instead of the commotion. She expected him to defend himself, to reveal the truth, or at least to argue. Instead, he stepped away from the microphone and walked toward Naomi. He knelt beside his daughter and gently zipped her backpack after noticing it had fallen open. Inside, Vivian caught a brief glimpse of the old metal lunchbox before Caleb quietly closed it again. Whatever was inside seemed far more important to him than the thousands of people staring at the stage. Why would a man abandon the perfect chance to prove himself just to protect an ordinary lunchbox? Elena noticed it too. She had spent decades producing concerts and reading performers, yet nothing about Caleb fit the pattern. Most people offered unexpected fame would chase it without hesitation. This man seemed determined to walk away from it. Caleb stood and removed the faded sheet of music from the piano. "I appreciate everyone's time," he said, "but I cannot break the promise I made." Trevor laughed in disbelief. "A promise is worth more than your future?" Caleb answered without raising his voice. "Some promises are worth more than any future." The words settled over the theater with unexpected weight. Vivian felt the confidence she had carried onto the stage begin to crack. She still believed there had to be another explanation. Perhaps this was a carefully planned stunt. Perhaps the mysterious witness and the old score were part of an elaborate performance. Yet nothing about the little girl's relieved smile looked rehearsed. The pianist quietly reached into his jacket and produced a small leather notebook. He compared a page inside with the handwritten score, then closed it immediately, as though confirming something he had secretly hoped was impossible. Elena caught the motion and asked what he had found, but the old musician simply whispered, "The handwriting matches." "Matches what?" Nobody answered. Before another question could be asked, Caleb's phone vibrated inside his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time that evening, the calm expression on his face changed. Naomi instantly recognized the number and clutched his sleeve. Without another word, Caleb picked up his work badge from the piano, apologized to no one, and hurried toward the backstage exit. Vivian watched him disappear beneath the dim hallway lights just as the call connected, and the only words everyone heard before the door closed behind him were, "St. Mary's Hospital? I am on my way right now." By the time Caleb reached St. Mary's Hospital, the automatic doors had barely finished opening before a nurse recognized him and waved him toward the pediatric wing. Naomi hurried beside him without asking a single question because she had seen that look on her father's face only once before. The rehearsal, the cameras, and the famous singer disappeared from his mind the moment he entered the quiet hallway lined with children's drawings. At the end of the corridor, an elderly volunteer music teacher named Mrs. Evelyn Porter struggled to comfort a frightened 12-year-old boy waiting for emergency heart surgery the following morning. The child refused every visitor and had stopped speaking hours earlier. The nurse quietly explained that the hospital had called Caleb because, for the past 3 years, he had volunteered there after work every Thursday evening, never asking for recognition and never telling anyone outside the hospital. Vivian, unable to shake the strange feeling that she had misunderstood him completely, drove across town with Elena after learning where he had gone. They arrived just in time to see Caleb kneel beside the boy instead of introducing himself. He simply asked whether the child wanted to hold the old lunchbox Naomi had carried so carefully. The boy nodded. Caleb opened it, revealing dozens of handwritten notes folded into tiny squares. Each contained encouraging words written by children who had already recovered and gone home. There was no money, no publicity, and no hidden contract inside. Only years of quiet kindness collected one message at a time. Vivian stood silently behind the doorway, confused again. If this man had truly abandoned a chance to reclaim fame, why had he spent years helping strangers without anyone knowing? Before anyone could answer, the frightened boy pointed toward the folded sheet of music still tucked beneath Caleb's arm and whispered that he wanted to hear whatever song everyone at the theater had been arguing about. Caleb smiled sadly and shook his head. "I cannot," he replied gently. "That song belongs to someone I promised never to disappoint." The answer calmed the boy, but it left everyone else with another mystery. Elena noticed a framed photograph hanging outside the room. In the picture, Caleb stood beside the same elderly pianist from the theater during a hospital charity concert nearly 2 decades earlier. The date matched the faded inscription on the manuscript almost exactly. Trevor suddenly arrived at the hospital carrying a folder of legal documents. Furious that the rehearsal had been interrupted, he announced that the production company intended to terminate Caleb immediately for abandoning his position during a nationally televised event. Several hospital staff members protested, explaining why Caleb had come, but Trevor insisted that contracts mattered more than excuses. Caleb accepted the envelope without opening it. He thanked the nurse for calling him, wished the young patient strength, and quietly turned toward the exit. Vivian watched in disbelief as he chose compassion over defending himself once again. Then Mrs. Porter hurried after him with tears in her eyes, holding an old newspaper clipping she had just found inside the lunchbox, and whispered, "Caleb, I think this finally explains why the entire music industry believed you disappeared 20 years ago." Mrs. Porter unfolded the yellowed newspaper clipping with trembling hands before anyone could leave. The hallway. The headline had faded almost beyond recognition, but one photograph remained clear enough to stop Vivian in her tracks. It showed a much younger Caleb standing beside a concert grand piano, surrounded by reporters and music scholars, smiling with a confidence completely different from the quiet maintenance technician she had challenged only hours earlier. The article itself had been damaged by time, leaving entire paragraphs unreadable, yet one sentence remained untouched. It described an original composition that critics had called the most anticipated debut of its generation before its public premiere was unexpectedly canceled. Vivian looked from the clipping to the folded manuscript still resting beneath Caleb's arm. The handwriting, the date, and the missing performance suddenly felt connected, but one question only grew larger. Why would a man disappear on the very night success had finally arrived? Trevor reached for the clipping, insisting it proved nothing, but Mrs. Porter calmly folded it away before he could take it. "Some stories belong to the people who live them," she said, "not to headlines." Caleb quietly thanked her, but his expression revealed no relief. If anything, he seemed more worried that the past had begun finding him again. Naomi slipped her small hand into his. She did not ask about the photograph because she had seen it before inside an old family box stored high in their apartment closet. As they walked toward the parking garage, Vivian found herself following several steps behind without planning to. She watched Caleb stop beside a faded pickup truck instead of a luxury car, carefully helping Naomi inside before placing the worn manuscript back into the metal lunchbox. He treated both objects with exactly the same care. That detail lingered in Vivian's mind. A priceless musical score and a lunchbox full of children's notes seemed equally valuable to him. What kind of person measured worth that way? Before Caleb could close the driver's door, The elderly pianist arrived carrying his leather notebook. He apologized for intruding, then quietly revealed another piece of the puzzle. 20 years earlier, he had rehearsed the same composition only once. The concert never happened because the composer vanished before the curtain rose, leaving behind no explanation, no farewell, and no request for credit. The pianist admitted he had spent 2 decades believing the unfinished masterpiece would never be heard again. Trevor dismissed the story as sentimental speculation, yet Elena noticed something far more convincing. On the final page of the manuscript, hidden beneath years of careful folding, there was a faint handwritten dedication. Most of the ink had disappeared, but 2 words remained perfectly legible. For Naomi. Vivian frowned immediately. That was impossible. Naomi was only 9 years old. How could a manuscript abandoned 20 years ago contain the name of a child who had not even been born? Caleb saw everyone staring at the page. His face lost its calm for the first time that night, and before anyone could ask another question, a black sedan pulled quietly into the parking garage. An elderly man stepped out holding a weathered violin case, looked directly at Caleb, and said, "I think it is finally time you told them who finished the song after you walked away." The elderly man slowly opened the weathered violin case, but instead of revealing an instrument first, he lifted out a thick leather portfolio, sealed with a faded blue ribbon. Every movement was deliberate, as though he had rehearsed this moment for years. He placed the portfolio on the hood of Caleb's pickup truck and looked directly at Vivian. "You wanted proof," he said quietly. "Then do not listen to opinions. Look at the evidence." Caleb lowered his eyes, but made no attempt to stop him. Inside the portfolio rested original handwritten orchestral scores, dated rehearsal schedules, studio contracts, and letters from respected conductors across the country. Every document carried the same unmistakable handwriting that appeared on the faded manuscript Caleb had protected all evening. Elena carefully compared the pages one by one. The paper had aged differently, yet the notation, phrasing, and even the smallest corrections matched perfectly. The mystery was no longer whether Caleb understood music. The evidence showed that some of the most admired musicians of their generation had once prepared to perform compositions that began in his hands. Vivian stood speechless. She had expected a hidden talent, perhaps even forgotten training, but not an entire career that seemed to vanish without explanation just before history could remember it. Trevor reached for one of the contracts, convinced there had to be another famous name attached somewhere inside. There was not. Every signature belonged to producers, conductors, and publishers. The composer's name had been intentionally covered with a strip of aging tape on every official copy, as though someone had erased him before the world ever learned who he was. "Who did that?" Vivian finally asked. The elderly violinist answered without hesitation. "He did." That simple response changed everything again. Caleb had not been pushed out. He had hidden himself. Naomi looked at her father with quiet pride, already knowing what everyone else had just begun to understand. Mrs. Porter gently removed the last document from the portfolio. It was not a contract, but a handwritten letter folded many times over. The paper had become fragile with age. Caleb immediately reached for it. "Please," he said softly. "Not that one." His voice carried more emotion than anyone had heard all night. The elderly violinist respected the request and placed the letter back inside without opening it. Vivian noticed something written across the outside of the envelope in elegant cursive. It read, "To be opened only after the promise has been fulfilled." Suddenly, every sacrifice Caleb had made began to carry new meaning. The maintenance job, the quiet apartment, the hospital visits, the refusal to sing, even the worn lunchbox filled with children's notes no longer looked like signs of a failed musician. They looked like deliberate choices made to protect something far more valuable than recognition. Yet one impossible question remained unanswered. If Caleb had willingly walked away from greatness, why was the promise still unfinished after 20 years? Before anyone could ask, Caleb's phone vibrated again. He read the message, closed his eyes for a brief moment, then turned toward Vivian for the first time since leaving the theater. "If I sing tonight," he said calmly, "a promise that has protected someone for 2 decades will finally come to an end. You need to decide whether the truth is worth what happens next." No one answered Caleb immediately because every person standing in the hospital parking garage understood that the decision no longer belonged only to him. Vivian slowly stepped forward, her confidence replaced by quiet humility. "If singing will hurt someone you promised to protect," she said, "then I have no right to ask you to do it." Trevor stared at her in disbelief. The same woman who had challenged Caleb only hours earlier was now prepared to walk away from the biggest publicity moment of her career. Elena noticed the change as well. The balance of power had shifted without applause, without headlines, and without a single performance. Caleb thanked Vivian with a gentle nod, but before he could respond, the elderly violinist carefully lifted the sealed letter from the portfolio once more. "There is something you all still do not understand," he said. The promise was never about protecting his reputation. Every eye turned toward the envelope. Caleb closed it again before anyone could unfold it. "Not yet," he whispered. Naomi stepped beside her father and quietly wrapped both arms around his hand. She had grown up seeing him choose other people over himself so many times that this moment did not surprise her. What surprised her was the sadness she saw in his eyes. Mrs. Porter suddenly realized that Caleb had never once denied being the composer. He had only refused to explain why he disappeared. That distinction changed everything. Trevor, still refusing to accept what was unfolding, called the production company's legal office and confidently announced that the maintenance technician had admitted abandoning his contract. Seconds later, his expression hardened. The attorney on the other end informed him that the company had already reviewed the documents Elena transmitted from the portfolio. Caleb's employment file included written authorization allowing emergency leave for his hospital. Volunteer work because the theater's former owner had personally approved it years ago. Trevor had threatened a man who had broken no rules. Embarrassed, he quietly lowered his phone without another word. Vivian looked toward Caleb with growing respect. The man she had mistaken for an ordinary technician had never argued, never defended himself, and never exposed anyone else's mistakes. Every choice he made had protected someone else instead. Yet the greatest mystery remained untouched. Why had he willingly erased his own name from history? At that moment, the pediatric nurse hurried through the hospital entrance with tears of relief. The frightened young patient had finally agreed to undergo surgery the next morning after reading every handwritten note inside Naomi's lunchbox. He had also left one new note behind. The nurse handed the folded paper to Caleb. It contained only one sentence written in a child's careful handwriting. "When you sing again, someone else will become brave too." Caleb read the message twice before carefully placing it beside the sealed letter. The two pieces of paper rested next to each other like answers waiting for the same question. He slowly looked toward Vivian, then toward Naomi, and finally toward the dark Nashville skyline. After 20 years of silence, he took a long breath and quietly said, "Take me back to the theater. It is finally time for everyone to hear the song exactly the way she wanted it remembered." When Caleb walked back onto the theater stage, not a single person laughed this time. The audience that had expected another spectacle rose instinctively from their seats, not because anyone asked them to, but because something about the quiet father carrying an old lunchbox and a folded manuscript demanded respect before a single note had been played. Vivian remained several steps behind him. She did not walk toward center stage. Instead, she moved one microphone stand aside and silently surrendered the spotlight to the man she had once challenged. That simple gesture said more than any public apology ever could. Trevor lowered his eyes, unable to escape the weight of everything he had assumed. Elena nodded to the orchestra, but no one began playing until Caleb carefully placed the handwritten score onto the piano once again. The elderly pianist smiled gently this time. His hands no longer trembled with uncertainty. They trembled because history had unexpectedly returned. Caleb looked across the audience, then toward Naomi sitting beside Mrs. Porter in the front row. She smiled exactly as she had before, reminding him that promises were not broken simply because they reached their ending. He finally spoke, and every voice inside the theater disappeared. "This song was never meant to make me famous," he said quietly. "It was written to remind one person that love can outlive silence." There were no dramatic speeches after that. The first piano notes floated through the hall with remarkable simplicity, carrying none of the showmanship expected from a concert of this size. Then Caleb began to sing. His voice was warm rather than loud, honest rather than perfect, and filled with the kind of quiet emotion that could not be manufactured through rehearsals or technology. One by one, every strange detail from the evening settled into place. The faded manuscript was no longer just old paper. The lunchbox was no longer an ordinary container. The hospital visits, the hidden handwriting, the forgotten photograph, and the years of silence all became parts of the same promise that had shaped a father's entire life. Vivian felt tears she never expected rise before she realized she was crying. She understood at last that she had not challenged a maintenance technician. She had unknowingly challenged a man whose greatest achievement had never been his extraordinary talent, but his willingness to leave it behind for someone he loved. When the final note faded, no one applauded immediately. The silence returned, but this time it carried gratitude instead of doubt. Only after several long seconds did the audience rise together, their applause filling every corner of the theater. Caleb accepted none of it as a victory. He simply walked to Naomi, knelt beside her, and placed the folded manuscript into her hands. "It belongs with you now," he whispered. Naomi hugged it tightly while the elderly violinist quietly placed the sealed letter beside it. Caleb looked at the unopened envelope for a long moment before resting his hand upon it. He had fulfilled the promise, but everyone standing nearby realized there was still one final truth waiting inside that letter, and none of them yet knew whether opening it would bring peace, heartbreak, or both. The theater slowly emptied long after the applause had faded, yet Caleb remained seated alone beneath the same white spotlight where the evening had begun. Earlier, that light had surrounded a man everyone believed was about to embarrass himself. Now it quietly illuminated someone who had never needed recognition to know who he was. Naomi walked across the stage carrying the old metal lunchbox in one hand and the handwritten manuscript in the other. She placed both beside her father exactly where his security badge had rested only hours before. For the first time, those ordinary objects no longer represented secrets. They represented a life measured by promises kept instead of dreams abandoned. Vivian approached without cameras, reporters, or security. She did not offer a recording contract, a concert tour, or another chance at fame. Instead, she handed Caleb the microphone he had used that evening and smiled. "I think it belongs to the man who reminded all of us what music is supposed to do." Caleb gently shook his head and placed the microphone on an empty chair. "Music was never mine to keep," he replied. "It was only mine to share when someone truly needed it." Elena quietly gathered the orchestra before they left and announced that every royalty generated from the restored composition would be donated to children's music and hospital programs in the name of anonymous families who chose love over recognition. Nobody argued. Even Trevor stepped forward and admitted he had judged success by titles instead of character. His apology was simple, and Caleb accepted it with the same calm grace he had shown throughout the night. The elderly violinist finally handed Caleb the sealed letter. This time, Caleb opened it. Inside was a single page written in careful handwriting from the person whose final wish had shaped the last 20 years of his life. The letter did not speak about awards, careers, or unfinished concerts. It simply thanked him for choosing to become the father their future daughter would always need instead of the celebrity the world wanted him to become. Naomi looked up as Caleb quietly folded the letter and slipped it into the lunch box beside the children's notes. She smiled through tears, finally understanding why her father had never spoken with regret about the life he left behind. As father and daughter stepped outside, the cool Nashville night greeted them with a gentle breeze. Across the street, the hospital lights glowed in the distance. Caleb looked toward them, then back at Naomi. "Do you think we should visit tomorrow?" he asked. She nodded immediately. "Someone will probably need another note." Together, they walked away from the theater without photographers following them. The spotlight disappeared behind closing doors, but the quiet strength that had carried them through the evening remained. Somewhere inside the now empty theater, the old piano still held the final page of music. The elderly pianist smiled as he carefully closed it, knowing that the greatest performance had never been the song itself. It had been the life of the man brave enough to sing it only when keeping a promise mattered more than being remembered. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.